Partha, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon.
Let me start from the beginning, because there may be people just joining us now for this part of the discussion. So let me say I'm Jagjit Chadha, the Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And it gives me enormous pleasure and privilege this afternoon to be able to enter into a discussion with Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, who's the Emeritus Professor, Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge. He's also a Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society, an extremely rare privilege, and has got honorary degrees and honours that would probably take up the whole hour for me to read out, so I won't. And I'll highlight one, if I may, Partha, and that's simply that you are also a governor of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. So I feel like I'm talking to one of my bosses today. So that's something which is will hopefully keep me in check. And what we're going to talk about today is very much the biodiversity review, which you've authored, that essentially carries your name, the Dasgupta Review. And I'm looking forward to discussing some of the insights from that and how we can shift minds and ultimately shift policy in the direction that I think you've accurately identified. Without giving the name away of the person this morning, I had an email from a senior government official who said that your work is being absorbed at the very highest levels all the way across government. And I think that's a remarkable achievement for an economist and reflects very well on not only your work, but the ability of economic science to change hearts and minds and ultimately policy. If I may just go back a little bit, though, before we launch into the discussion of the review, I want to just take a second to remind ourselves of some of your earlier work, which was an inquiry into destitution and poverty. I think it was one of the first books of yours that I read. I think it was published in the mid-1990s. It sits on my office desk. And one of the interesting chapters there is, as well, the extent to which you were trying to understand the role of economics in changing political institutions and getting them to match the welfare of society and the problems that you saw. And I suppose, was that the first observation you had as a you're still a young economist, but as a younger economist, in terms of you were thinking about what we can do? It's not simply the use of instruments, but it's actually the design of institutions and political frameworks that really matter. Is that right, to sort of highlight that book as an emerging aspect of the work that we're now seeing in the diversity review as well?
Absolutely, wholly so. It's a springboard for the review that I've just completed. Of course, at the time I was writing it, I didn't know I was going to write a review. But you're absolutely right. There's nothing more to say. But before we go into a discussion,
yes,
I should just simply say I thought your interchange, your discussion with Klaus a few minutes ago was outstanding. And we should use that as the basis of our discussion, because at the heart of the macroeconomic side of my review is the idea of charting economic possibilities in the future. Without that, we are nowhere.
Yeah.
So that's, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, other than to say I really enjoyed that conversation you just had with Klaus, and was exactly dead right.
Well, that's very kind of you, Partha. It means a lot. We have, as an independent institute, and as our colleagues in Europe have, this constant battle about trying to get people to understand why it's so valuable to think about counterfactuals, to think about the flow of news, and to spend a large amount of time trying to explain those results to people and understand the richness of the analysis that my colleagues undertake. I'm just so often trying to be a consumer rather than a producer, but then to spend time getting policymakers into that space as well. I very much see your review about that kind of territory, getting policymakers to absorb the ideas and then ultimately act upon them. And I suppose in the end, become accountable for them. There's a danger in there, isn't there? Particularly with something as, can I say, long-lived, or something that's so far on the horizon as climate change, that people can say, well, I can't do anything about it. It's all in the future. And it won't matter. Now, clearly, it's not in the future. Climate change is something that's affecting us now. The denudation of the environment, or the reduction in biodiversity, is an issue that's affecting us now.
Yeah.
But it's so obviously the case that a politician, and of course we name no names, there's a relatively short horizon and may be able to kick the can down the road for the period in which they are in office. And so our constant problem as people thinking about the long run is, how do we get policymakers who are inevitably affected by short run news, events, disasters, can focus on issues that will yield benefits over the long run, when in fact in the short run it might just add to those problems that the politicians face. This is the critical issue that we face all the time. And I'm kind of wondering, how do we think we can solve that problem on the back of your review?
Okay, I think there are 3 points I could make on that. The first one is that it is sometimes thought that we have our ethical framework as a bedrock on which we build economics. I believe there's an interchange here. What we believe to be the correct way of thinking about the world, I don't mean instrumentally, but fundamentally, is influenced by what is possible. In other words, what's the desirable is influenced by what's possible, and what's possible, of course, is influenced by what is desirable. There's a mutual interchange. So that's the first point. The second point is that, relatedly, is that if we do economics correctly, and I should begin by simply saying that the review, as honestly and as dispassionately as I could, comes with establishes or shows that the fault of the reason for our ailments, economic ailments, and what we are doing to the biosphere is not due to the fault of economics. It's the way we have chosen to practice it. And that our forecasts, if you like, are based on models which do not deserve scrutiny. And we have to put an alternative. It's easy to criticize. You have to put up a equally convincing, tight framework, and we'll try to do that in it. And we can discuss how and why in a minute. And I came back to your conversation with Klaus, because your conversation was about the long run, entirely about the long run, and that you need to talk about counterfactuals. Because if you don't have counterfactuals, it means you've just literally guessed what's going to happen. Counterfactuals mean that you have a model on the basis of which you're making your forecast. Okay, so that you can shift the parameters around them, or even the state variables around, and then okay. So that's the second point. The third point, I think, is, and it's related to the issue of how do you persuade politicians, and that is to show that, this second point already points to it in some direction, because if you do it right, you're saying that even today you're doing mistakes, making mistakes. So don't talk about, we're doing things all right now. I'm a short-term chap. I have five-year horizon. What happens in the 10th year, I'll kick away. But if you have got the right model, you'll be finding that actually things you're doing are damaging the environment now and the economy now. Okay, so that's also important. And the third point is that I think ultimately, and that is what the review does. The review does, although it was commissioned by the Treasury, it's not, I wasn't writing to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, let alone the Prime Minister. I was writing to the concerned citizen. Because at the end of the day, it is the citizen who is going to push for changes in policy. And we are beginning to witness it now. Children are involved in it now. And they influence their parents, who hopefully will influence their teachers in school, having changing curricula, which is being resisted quite a bit in primary school, for example, to introduce nature studies. There's a terribly important thing. We ought to know something about the world around us before we can start judging things. So I think the role of the citizen is huge. And my aim primary aim in the review, and it's written right through the chapters, is the following. There's a clash of intuitions between the economist current, if you like, received growth and development economics on the one hand, and the intuition that, if you like, the non-economist who goes around his or her business on a daily basis has about what's going on in the world. How often have you not heard? It's all very well, we are growing, but what are we doing to nature or the landscape or the place that I go and I see destroyed. So there's a tension there. And the question, and what I was trying to do is to bring the language, the grammar of economics to bear on it, to show the citizen that her intuition is right, that she should not be bulldozed by the economist who says, well, look, it's all very well for you to say, but where's the bottom line? Okay.
I cough sometimes and I put myself on mute.
No, you.
Yeah, I'm back now. I think it's pollen makes me cough. So I'm kind of going back to that point about the structures of the models and the extent to which the economists may not have models that, in some crude sense, measure biodiversity or the environment, and therefore they're not necessarily capturing the intuition of the young who feel that there's something wrong about our analysis. And this is something you've been very clear about, and that is, the imbalance between our demands on nature and its overall supply. It's something that we're not getting right in terms of understanding that this is a finite resource that we have there, and the demands we're making on it, and that in a sense, are not capturing the impact on the supply of those natural resources. And that's where the models are at fault. And that's the gap between the economists' models as they stand and the intuition of the next generation, which I can tell you, having children myself, is much smarter than the current generation, who understand that there's something wrong. Is that what we're trying to?
That's exactly right. And as you rightly do, formally speaking, what's going on is the fact that the received models of growth and development that have been in the 80s, 90s, and this century do not have nature as an asset. The capital assets we look at are produced capital and human capital, and knowledge, of course, but not natural capital. And when climate change models are introduced, the climate is tagged on to a conventional model with maybe a damage function or some such thing.
Yes.
So that you can talk about investment in cleaning up the dirt that we are, or not producing the dirt.
Yeah.
The problem is that that's just one of nature's services, which is the climate regulations. And you are pointing to the vast array of other services, including waste clearance, which need to be taken into account. So the idea really will be to have macroeconomic models of growth and development really need to be embedded in nature, keep track. Obviously, not everything goes without saying. The model is a model.
Yes.
Primary regulatory services that nature provides, which includes climate regulation, but it also has nitrogen fixation and some of the really powerful things which are interrelated with climate, so that the complementarity of these services that Mother Nature offers, and they are complementary, by the way, they're not substitutes, they're complementary, that should be included in it in order to be able to, if nothing else, for example, estimate shadow prices, accounting prices, and then have them as stocks so that you can have an inventory of stocks that we are passing on to the next generation, or year to year, if you like. Instead of looking at flows like GDP, go for stocks, those inventory accounting, including natural capital.
And one of the tangible examples you give as to the measurement of activity that doesn't account for its impact on the environment is transport or travel, something that requires us to use the ocean, or to some degree potentially harm the atmosphere in some way from the way that we travel. Are these good examples to keep in our mind if we go back to the heuristic?
Absolutely.
People need to understand these things. Could you expand on those thoughts?
Yes, you think of these
you've discussed often.
Yes, these are open access resources. The atmosphere as a sink for our deposits of carbon, for example, carbon in one case, but there are other things as well. And the oceans as a vehicle for transportation, fisheries, and so forth. Let's just take two of these. Of course, another class of global assets are the peatlands, which may not look global, but they provide a global service. They're a huge stock of carbon. If they let loose the carbon, I tell you, talk about climate change is going to be over. So these are supplying global public goods. So let's concentrate only on those just for the sake of argument. So you've got a whole bunch of global public goods some of which are open access, like the atmosphere, as well as this open seas, so that we don't pay any price.
Yeah.
Because we immediately, a first-year undergraduate economist is going to say there's a problem here. We're going to be overusing it.
Yeah.
Okay. And the second one is that large numbers or substantial global public goods, like, for example, the tropical rainforests, they are not open access, but they are because they are within national jurisdictions. But they are supplying a global public good.
Yes.
Okay. So now you have a first-year undergraduate economist is going to say, well, doesn't it suggest that there should be some kind of a payment for ecosystem services that these countries would offer us if they resist transforming their forests into beef cattle ranches or soybean plantations, which are they're doing, and they're saying we needed to develop ourselves. Okay, yes. So who are you to tell us? Who are you in London to tell us that we shouldn't do that? And in some sense, they're justified in saying that. Of course, I don't quite believe them because they're doing wrong calculations and thinking the rates of return are extremely high in having beef cattle plantations. But never mind that. There's a core truth in it. Yes. And so we do have a management problem here, which we haven't accounted for. And none of the growth models that I've read in graduate textbooks of the late 1990s, early 2000s, makes any mention of it. So why should I trust the analysis and the jubilation that is carried in these textbooks about how well we have done in the last 200 years? Look at the growth, the time series of GDP per capita, life expectancy, and so forth. They are wonderful stuff because telling us we have done marvelously. But meanwhile, we're actually cutting down the basis on which this entire framework of the architecture is built. So that's the tension that the review looks at.
Yes, and in some sense, that ability to measure certain aspects of our activity to make it look as though we've been growing very fast actually might turn out to have been taking away standard of livings from future generations.
That's exactly right.
We're going to have to suffer with a much lower level of biodiversity than we might ideally want. I mean, that's one way of thinking about what you've
That's exactly right. And by the way, one should think that it's not simply, one should point out that it's always helps to focus in on micro community structures. Yeah. Because what we are saying is likely to happen or will happen if we aren't careful. 2 generations, 3 generations down the road are already being experienced by small groups.
Yes.
Distress migration, for example, from really not ecologically collapsed communities, that is local ecosystems, is a symptom of that.
Yes. No, I can see that entirely. So that leads to, the next question is what you're saying so clearly, and this is something that many people have said sort of less formally and perhaps less convincingly, if I might say, but the way you put it is incredibly convincing, is that we need to think very hard about the way we measure our economic progress / success, or the extent to which we're getting better off. The focus on GDP growth, for example, as it is currently measured. We're going to see some stunning numbers this year because of the recovery from the collapse in the economy last year, which itself is misleading. I don't want to go into that. That's fairly dull stuff. But just this idea that we're focusing on particular widgets being produced doesn't in any way capture this notion of genuine social and economic progress that doesn't threaten the environment. So we need different measures, and that's something that's clearly come across in your work as well. Have you some ideas as to how we might begin to progress that?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. In fact, it happens you're the right person to ask the question, because I gave one of the earlier Stone lectures at the National Institute precisely on a theorem I had recently proved with Karl-Johan Mailer. Okay, so what is it? We're, at the end of the day, really concerned with something like human well-being. Okay, and not human well-being today, but tomorrow, day after, and so forth and so on. So we have a pretty rich understanding amongst economists anyway of a normative architecture for normative thinking about intergenerational equity, if you like. Okay, so that's what we're after. We want to say that at the end of if you really are concerned with, say, sustainable development, you want to ask the question as to whether the the forecast, to use your words, the ones that you were discussing with Klaus, a good reasoned forecast has intergenerational welfare increasing over time or not. That would be deemed as progress. Okay. Yes. Yes. All right. Now, the theorem says that to remind us that what we can produce and how we can live depends on the assets we hold. And I include, of course, institutions, which give the backdrop, social background in which the assets are allocated and accumulated, decumulated, and so forth. All this is bread and butter economics. All right. Yeah. So the idea is, how does welfare map onto the structure of your assets? Mm-hmm. And the theorem says that there is a measure of the totality of your assets, of an economy's assets, which are physical, produced capital, human capital, natural capital, such that, and we'll call that inclusive wealth, because that is what wealth is. It's the accounting value of your assets.
Yes.
Such that if human well-being increases over time, then so does inclusive wealth. And if inclusive wealth increases over time along the trajectory, along the forecast, then so does human well-being. In other words, they're equivalent for all. Right. They're not the same, because in the one case you're measuring human well-being, and in the other case you're measuring the value of your assets.
Yes.
The connection is the accounting prices, because as we all know, accounting prices are a mixture of the feasible and the possible and the desirable. Yes. So the connection between the roads and buildings and wetlands and education as capital assets,
yes,
and welfare is related through their marginal values of the accounting prices. So we are interested in the wealth of nations. We're not interested in the GDP of nations if we want to study the progress or regress of nations, because ultimately it is human well-being you're interested in. And what you're trying to do is to get an economic counterpart of that. And that is inclusive wealth. And the thing is, you can have GDP growing even while an accumulation of produced capital, natural capital, and human capital, yes, but cutting down on natural capital in such a way that your GDP looks as though it's moving at a fast rate, high, positive rate.
Yes.
Okay. Meanwhile, your inclusive wealth is declining because yes, the negative, the disinvestment in nature is overcoming the positive investment in the other forms of capital, which is straightforward. I mean, it can happen. You can see why it can happen. You're basically trading off nature. You're eating into nature and converting it into produced capital and human capital. Yes. And in the past, we would say, oh, we're just substituting material goods for nature. Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, but the problem is, if you do that too much, then nature collapses and your possibility of substitution in the future is going to be jeopardized. And that's what the review is about.
Sure, but how do we get at the right prices for some of these natural?
Right, there are methods of trying to get. Sure, yeah, of course, and as we all know, this is nothing new. We are not going to get the accounting prices of everything. Goes without saying. Quite apart from anything else, the use value of nature may be measurable, but many people regard certain aspects of nature as sacred. Yes. Non-use value.
Yes, yes,
and that's part of welfare, so it will be part of accounting prices. So the issue is not whether we can actually measure inclusive wealth, and I can't imagine any government would be foolhardy enough to say now the inclusive wealth of our country is so many trillion dollars in PPP, and then it's increased by 2%. I'm not expecting that to happen, and it shouldn't happen. It's stupid. But what does a good economist suggest we should do when you can't? That's an ideal, a platonic ideal, which can't be reached. Mm-hmm. Well, you work backwards. You know what you want, but you need to cut corners because you can't get there. Yeah. The advantage of having a good tight theory, and that's what you and Klaus were discussing before, is that you know what the corners you're cutting when you cut corners. Mm-hmm. And then you can have some estimate of where you're going wrong. So I would expect, generally speaking, to follow the route, the desirable route is the one which is being followed by the UK, which is to have estimates of natural capital when you can. Mm-hmm. And you do that by hiring ecologists to join forces with economists to track the health of ecosystems, the wetlands, the fisheries, the forest, woodlands, and so forth. The peatlands. There's good ways of measuring how they're functioning. Okay, you have a huge vector of functions, by the way. I mean, you don't get one number, but that's all right. You can still have a qualitative statements about, look, the wetlands look not so good over this last decade. They've been declining, or we have transformed the landscape because of agricultural extensions, such that it's jeopardized life forms, birds, bees, and so forth.
Yes.
They're qualitative things, but the others are all stocks. That's the main thing. They're assets. So if we concentrate on the assets and a description of the assets, I would expect to be able to do quite a lot of. You can have a matrix of that. Over the last decade, road networks have increased by so many miles, let us say. Floor space of factories have expanded by so much, and so forth. More education, you name it, all that. How much of investment has gone up? Parallel, we should have a statement about the stocks of our natural capital. And they will not be in price. In some of them, they will be in prices, sure. Because, for example, in fisheries, in principle, you could use market prices.
Yes.
To get a first cut at accounting price of the fish. And then if you have an estimate of stocks, you're in business. At least you're in, as a first approximation, you're in business. But most countries don't have inventories of their assets. And that's, never mind the fine tuning of inclusive wealth. We have to start somewhere. And where we should start is to say, well, look, create an inventory. Forest cover, which is very easy to do nowadays, by the way, because of you can take pictures from outer space, right? But you need to know also what's going on in the forest, the character of the forest. And by the way, local populations have enormous amount of information on that. So in poor countries in Africa, South Asia, it's not an out of the world question to use communities to describe the quality and to help officials, if you like, in New Delhi and Dhaka, the quality, the character of their ecosystems, and that could be verified. Of course, you're not going to take any statement that comes along lying down, but then you have to interchange because they are on the ground. They have much more information about the local ecosystem, just as we do here in this country too, by the way. I mean, we look for NGOs that are hugely involved in natural capital accounting, and they contribute to it too, which is exactly right.
So this inventory idea is incredibly appealing. I couldn't help thinking we could call it the new Doomsday Book in terms of trying to get away with capital.
Well, that is for tax purposes, I'm told.
Well, yes. Well,
no, absolutely.
Everything that gets measured will end up getting taxed by our friends in the Treasury at some point. But the idea of a Doomsday Book with the proper meaning behind it could be very interesting. If the Normans could do it a millennium ago, I guess we could do it now. Think very carefully about what's going on. But is there a danger? I'm just listening to you talk, and it's always a pleasure, that some of this might become an argument for just conserving what we've got. Nothing can be lost. Wherever we are in the wetlands or the peatlands, that's just sacrosanct. It can't be changed. Is that a danger of this thinking?
I think at the moment where we speak, at the point from where you're speaking now, the danger has been long, it's long gone. I mean, there's no danger of it at all. We have actually done a huge amount. I mean, England is really notorious. We may have very good intentions for the future, but by Jove, the amount of biodiversity we have left is just minuscule of what we have inherited. So I don't think there is danger, largely because, of course, there is always trade-off. And remember, the bulk of the argument is going to come from the private sector, unless they're ecologically minded or concerned about their own profitability statements in the future, or economists who will be saying, well, I can give you a number as to what the rate of return on this investment is, and that's, let us say, 10%, risk adjusted, and you tell me why we should save this ecosystem. Then, of course, the first thing I will ask is, have you taken ecosystems into account when you do your cost-benefit analysis of the project? And you will be hard-pressed to do that because you would have got the data. So I would say, first of all, revise your estimate of rate of return. It should include the fact that actually the road network that you're constructing, which you're assessing, is actually eaten into the wetland. So I think the problem is not so much that. There will always be economists who will be talking about trade-offs. And in any case, we can feel the trade-off, all right? Because the tangible objects are the ones which we can be aware of their loss. So the first cut would be, gosh, you mean you're giving up 10% return just to save the few birds? But that's not how I would put it. I wouldn't be putting it in terms of the birds. I would be talking about all the services the wetland actually offers you, like, for example, cleaning water, filtering water, quite apart from anything else, storing carbon. If it's a peatland, my gosh, it's a huge. So I would value the asset. If you want to use carbon social cost of carbon, I would say value the peatland in terms of the shadow price of carbon that it's holding. Yes. And that would be gigantic if you think about it. So I wouldn't worry about that. At least put it this way: there will be enough number of people who will be arguing the other way.
And I suppose it's something that the government could take a lead in its own assessment of infrastructure or other projects, a so-called green book that tries to understand what the benefits are of particular projects. And if these, if the government took the lead in thinking about the factors you're talking about in assessing any of its investment choices, then that would provide a lead for the private sector to think about these things as well.
I think absolutely right. I think I can see. I think there's a good deal of justice in where you're coming from. What the motivation behind your previous question was, and that is because I suspect, say, 15, 20, 30 years ago, the environmentalist was a crying in the wilderness sort of chap. All right, saying, stop this, don't do that, and so forth.
Howling at the wind.
Exactly. And we economists are rightly wedded to the idea of estimating trade-offs.
Yeah.
So we don't like quantity constraints because we think that suggests that the accounting price is either infinity or sufficiently large that it is telling you that you have to have a quantity constraint. Yeah. Now, in many cases, that's a very good idea, by the way. Sophisticated economics tells us that in the face of uncertainty, asymmetric information, and particularly irreversibility, you'll be mad to use only prices, even Pigouvian taxes.
Yes.
Okay. We know
some
that. We have theorems.
Makes sense. Some rationing makes sense in that world.
Yeah, we have theorems for that. And since the uncertainty prevails in a huge way here, we are looking at accounting prices, which themselves are uncertain.
Yeah.
For every state variable, in the state of the world, there'll be a corresponding accounting price. So you'll be looking at something like a mean accounting price, and then you correct for uncertainty and so forth. So that's a different set of consideration. The core consideration is that, yes, you do. And there'll be lots of cases where you actually say, no go. And the idea of having 30% of land and water as protected zones that countries are increasingly will probably enact in COP15 is a reflection of that idea. Now we can now start complaining that why choose 30%, and I would be complaining that it'll be about the waters under control of nations, and therefore it leaves open the open oceans, which we began discussing a few minutes ago.
Yes.
That's not going to be covered at all. But the worry should not be for us economists that we will be overdoing it. We've been so underdoing it,
right?
And the gap between demand and supply is so huge, as the reviews collates data to say the ratio is something demand to supply is 1.6 or 1.7 or so.
Right.
It's huge. I mean, we're in a firefighting stage. Then I don't think we should be worried about that side yet.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to go through one final set of questions with you, but also remind the audience that's listening to send some questions. And we've had some questions come in, which we'll turn to in a minute and try to get through them by the time our allotted moment in the sun is over. Of course, the sun has gone away today. It's from rather terrible weather, but it's okay. It's good for the garden, so that's probably a good thing. So we kind of agreed that there is this imbalance between demand on nature and its supply, and you've come up with the ratios that are of great concern, and we need to think harder about how to, either through prices or through quantity restrictions, reduce those demands. And we've been very clear that needs to be done. And in the middle of that as well, to understand the marginal project we might want to undertake, we also need to understand our measures of economic outcomes. And that would mean a whole range of prices to be thought about for biodiversity and the environment, wetlands, the sea, and other things. And I think we're beginning to understand the enormity of the challenge, but also, as you've said, and using a phrase that's popular in central banking circles, we're pretty much behind the curve. We haven't done enough so far, and we're far way behind where we ought to be. And I think that's coming across very clearly in our discussion. Which then leads me to the third area of discussion is institutional change. To the extent to which a country can operate over its own borders and make choices that matters for it alone, there's one set of issues. But for the extent to which these biodiversity issues spill over to the rest of the world or require coordination internationally, I think it opens a huge number of issues about the international institutional structure we have for international economic policy making. It's almost impossible to cover those issues in a few minutes, but it would be really helpful to get your guidance as to what we need to be focusing on with COP26 on the horizon, with big questions about the importance of G7, G20, the involvement of the newly emerging nations in both the World Bank and the IMF. There seems to be this sense in which the whole post-war structure that we had of the Bretton Woods Institutes needs to be rethought as well, if not only because of the issues that you raise, but highlighted by the issues that you raise. That's a rather large question, and you can take it any way you want, but I did want to spend some time on those institutional matters if I can.
Very fair. Very fair. And let me try at least to give you two examples so where we can do, maybe if we have time, we'll go to a third one. First one, of course, we've actually covered over the global commons.
Yeah.
And there we have a big institutional hole.
Yeah.
We don't have any institutions, really. Even the carbon issues, we don't have an institution. We have agreements, yes, and commitments of some kind, but half the world isn't involved in it even. So, it's if that's how we want to proceed, go ahead, but it's not how an economist would prescribe. You have a global public good, it should be managed in the sense public goods are. On top of that, of course, there is a huge subsidy of nature, of depleting nature. So it's negative price. And one institutional reform would be to lift these subsidies, subject to the recognizing there are political constraints. Goes without saying, there'll be people that coming up at arms and so forth, and some you can override, others you need to compensate and so forth. But there's a mess. But we really have a structure of bad sets of prices for goods at the global level. So that's one that I can say, and that really requires institutional overhaul and needs to be faced. The more we use economics to settle these issues, the better it is. That's the point. This is not an emotional issue. It's a really resource allocation problems of massive failure. Okay, so that's one. At the thing that might turn poorer countries around to the way our conversation is going, which is to look at inventories, is the following. It is not an accident that the greatest amount of biodiversity, the richest biodiverse areas, regions, are in the tropics. That comes out of the earth sciences and ecology, goes without saying. But it's also the case that they're amongst the poorest countries in the tropics. So the history of modern development, global development, has been primary products from their financing and going into investment in the richer countries where it's transformed into goods and services. And of course, trade takes place. So it's not as though this is not a boring old anti-capitalist diatribe. Okay, this is how it's happened. Okay.
Perish the thought.
Yeah, exactly. So, however, we use comparative advantage theory, and we use theories of efficiency of free trade and the desirability of free trade badly. We misuse it because the theorems are correct only if you have a complete set of prices, complete set of markets with competitive prices. Well, the whole point about the economics of biodiversity and climate change is that there are missing markets, massive missing markets. Okay, so now poor countries, let's look at it from the perspective of a primary producer of coffee beans or whatever, or cocoa, or you name it. Okay, and you're shipping it out. Now the externalities involved in their production, the external diseconomies that are occurring, because let's say the external harm that is suffered by farmers, fishermen in the downstream, for example. Take the simple case of deforestation of the uplands. All right. So a country has rich in tropical forest, hardwood, wants to export it, says it needs foreign exchange, for growth and development. Standard story. Okay.
Yes.
Now, in the process of doing that, of course, it's harming downstream farmers and fishermen because soil erosion, you name it. And there's rich literature on that. Yeah. But the export price doesn't reflect that harm.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And therefore, what? That it means that there's been resource transfer, i.e. wealth transfer from the poor to the rich through this international trade.
Yes.
Nobody's conspiring necessarily, although there must be a hell of a lot of that too. But never mind. Pure economics is telling us that there is a wealth transfer. Now that should cause alarm amongst leaders in poor countries because basically they're opting in favor of a wealth transfer, subsidizing the rich to grow richer still.
Yes.
Now, they wouldn't know that from GDP estimates. They only know it if they have an inventory and say, well, actually, we are depleting the natural capital downstream.
Yeah.
So that's a second class of issues that I think poor countries now really ought to think about.
Yeah.
And they can only think about it logically if they do economics honestly in the way that we are discussing here, which is to take. And one final point. The idea of inclusive wealth might seem as though it's very new. And it's certainly, the theorem is new. It was proved only in 2000, published in 2000, but in its general form. But it's old in the following sense. When we evaluate in social cost-benefit analysis, as we have known it for about 70, 80 years, when we evaluate a project, what is it we look for? We look for net present value, accounting prices, no doubt, and so forth. But what is net present value? It is the weighted sum of the flow of net benefits from the project. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, but the sum of flows is a stock. So what net present value is measuring is the change in the wealth of the nation that is being created by the project. If it's negative, you're saying, well, actually, it's reducing wealth, so reject it. If it's positive, you say it's increasing wealth and therefore accept it. So even in the policy area, within policy, we've already got inclusive wealth, but we didn't know that. We call it net present value or internal rate of return or one of the equivalent thing.
If I go back to I agree with everything you said, but just think about the practicalities of the institutions we might need if there is a commodity producing country exporting its commodities at a set of prices that don't reflect the impact on their biodiversity or their natural capital, whichever phrase you want to use there. And we try to correct that either directly on the price of the commodities or by an intergovernmental transfer subsequently, taking account the amount of trade that there is. You could work that out and say, well, this is our view upon what you said earlier. Maybe we haven't got the exact number, but we've got a view of what it should be. Or we restrict the amount of trade, going back to your quantity point. But let's just say we allow the trade to continue.
Yeah.
We imagine for themselves at some point there's been a mispricing. There's been some denudation of the natural capital, which then requires the importing country or set of countries to provide some financial support back the other way to the exporting countries. How can we get those mechanisms right so they land on protecting the environment or allowing that country to recover some of its natural capital? So is there not an institutional capability problem in those countries as well? That money will not necessarily help them. I'm not saying it's an argument against not doing it, but it means there's a need for institutional reform of a quite fundamental level in these countries as well.
Yes, of course, if it's a predatory state, and there are plenty of predatory states, there's nothing to be said. You and I can write till the cows come home where they're going to be predating. So that's not an issue. We are assuming that some reason can prevail. Okay, there is a scope for discussion and possibly changing policies. Well, one of the first things I would recommend is, after all, the poor countries always have collectives. It's a community and they have annual meetings or biannual meetings and so forth for some joint communiques about helping each other develop. I think these countries should make use of it to have a collective view on this matter, because a country on its own, unilaterally, we are in a Nash equilibrium, remember, with the wrong prices. We got a Nash equilibrium where it's not exactly very intelligent for a country on its own to say we're going to now raise the export price because they'll be undercut by their competitors.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so that's clear. but we're talking about a collective behavior on the part of poor countries, or if you like,
yes,
primary product producing countries. That's one thing. And then secondly, internal institutional problems. I would say we overdo that issue because we think that, and it has something to do with the character of investment. If you think of investment in, let's say, road building or creating a new port, we really have a serious organizational issue, okay? Because, you've got to bring in all sorts of experts in to work on it. Investment, $1 billion investment is not exactly a joke. It requires, and you don't want to see that the money doesn't leak away and God knows what else. All right. But restoring nature is a different animal altogether. It means waiting. It doesn't mean you have to put in a lot of money. Stay away from the wetland. Let it recover. That's called letting the regenerative rate, regeneration capacity of the, you may have to do some helping, of course, go without saying, maybe creating a alternative avenue for the refuse which you're dumping into the wetland from the urban center. Okay, so that is an investment, fine, I grant you that. But you don't want to mess around necessarily a hell of a lot in the wetland itself.
Right.
The wetland management is really small potato in terms of financial needs. So I think for that reason, there is a great advantage in that you can make use of local community knowledge and organizations, which poor countries have actually not used anywhere near to how much they should have. That is to say, if nothing else, the post-independence period from the 50s, let us say, or 40s, let us say, and the 60s onwards, big changes that are taking place. Nations have had to consolidate their state power. How have they done it? There's a rich literature on this, by the way. I'm not inventing it. Much of it is in the review because I've had to review it. It's extremely important for the subject in hand, which is you do that, and you do that by replacing community management, because there was no law. So there were social norms of behavior. Yes. And they could be pretty strident, by the way. You misbehave and you really get, your neighbors. Okay. Yes, all right. Now that the norms of behavior, social norms, which have guided resource allocation, protected up to a point, not always, but in large measure, enables communities to survive.
Yes.
They have been undermined by inept state governance.
Yes. Yes.
So I would say we overdo the worry about organizational structure. Maybe here should be withdrawing of the state from management issues. They shouldn't, of course, withdraw from many other activities which are extremely important, providing schools and family planning service and so forth. Goes without saying, that's for sure. But in terms of reviving ecosystems, we are not talking big money, except in terms of opportunity cost, of earning money at the expense of natural capital. We've gone through that argument already, okay? So we're not talking big money in investment here. And we're not talking about big money in terms of organizational changes, except insofar as it may be hard for government officials to withdraw from where they were meddling before. Now, that's a psychological problem.
No. I think I have this mental picture now of trying to support local collectives who generation after generation understand their environment or the biodiversity that they're trying to nurture, and would understand very well that they need to guard it for future generations and help them to protect that land against other people within that country or from overseas coming in.
Yes, that may have been the origin, but today I would pose it in a different way.
Yeah.
Because an enlightened view would be, of course, my child may leave the village. And good for him if he wishes to do that and gets himself a university professorship or directorship of an institute and so forth.
Whatever may land on his head at some point in the future.
That's fine. But today, the argument would be much more that, yes, we are doing this because, in fact, maybe the state will subsidize us a little bit, not in terms of telling us how to do it, because we'll be using indigenous knowledge. And of course, it'll be always useful to have ecologists around, by the way, who are much more community friendly than we economists are. Because ecologists happen to, their entire research agenda is to work with local people to try and understand what's going on, all right, the data collection and all that. So yes, there would be movement in both directions, There'll be some help coming from the state, but not. Essentially, the task of the protection would be, I mean, the one model would be to leave it to the, and they will be accountable. At the end of the year, you'll have to, they have to show that it's happening. And, but they wouldn't be doing it saying that we're doing it because I expect my grandchild to be looking after the wetland. He or she may not. But we're doing it because that's part of our national capital. And just as a factory owner says, I'm going to leave behind a good business because, but even though.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking so much about the child necessarily, but the tribe, in a sense, that group of people. So there'll be.
Well, of course, if it starts collapsing, then you have to sort of move in. I mean, but at the moment, there still is an echo, a strong echo of local knowledge, and we should exploit that. And in any case, they live there. And if they live there currently, then of course there'll be, all the moral hazard, adverse selection problems that loom very large in institutional design. You'll actually be solving many of them if you rely on the local knowledge. That's the whole point.
No, very much so. Now, Partha, we're coming towards the end of this fascinating hour. It's flown by. I can't imagine that so much time has gone, but it's been wonderful talking to you. We have some questions coming in from some of the people attending the conference. I wonder if I could, in a sense, just repeat them to you and not take any blame for them, if I may. I'm just sort of trying to open it up. So I have a question from Mohammed Ali Nazir at the University of Huddersfield, who's throwing the Malthus gauntlet at us, which is that economists have consistently been wrong about resource constraints since Malthus. And how can we be more confident that we've got it right this time? Perhaps you could just outline why we are more sure this time than we were in the past.
Well, look, the question is what it is you're getting it right or wrong on. I'm not quoting figures about estimates of wealth or forecast of wealth. I haven't got a model. I've got the review has a formal model, by the way, but it's a complete abstract one at the moment. Most of the functions have not been estimated. There's a long way to go. But what I would say is we are far more correct now than we were before because the model has things which were overlooked.
Right.
And there is enough data to show that what was overlooked is extremely important. So perforce, we are in a better shape now than we were before in terms of economics.
Well, I hope, Mohammed Ali, that helps a little bit to think about why we're more confident this time. We have a question from Baya at the city of Montreal in Canada. And I guess we've touched upon this a bit, but perhaps we could just repeat ourselves if necessary or expand. And that's how do we price the impact of climate change in 20 to 100 years from now, depending on different trajectories of natural capital? Do we have a view as to what would happen to the climate if natural capital was denuded or not denuded or indeed augmented?
That's an extremely good question, but I wouldn't go into that kind of a detail in any model.
Okay.
I would essentially, beyond a certain, because the good question is extremely good because it recognizes that the accounting price, quote unquote, of carbon in year 2100 will depend on the entire inventory of stocks in year 2100 minus 1.
Yes.
Okay, so that's for sure. And that's why you have to really can't only look at climate, carbon in the atmosphere, you've got to look at the state of other ecosystems as well. But leaving that aside, the uncertainties are so huge, and not just because the economic uncertainties, ecologists, climate scientists can't tell you. They don't know how many, the models are extremely nonlinear. We have only local knowledge because we've seen perturbation. The historical trends have actually picked a piece of the potential trajectories, that we observe. So it goes without saying, you have theoretical model building on the basis of small-scale modeling to give an idea of nonlinearities and therefore possible tipping points, various tests. And maybe there are multiple ones. In fact, there's very good reason for that. And there's a good deal of that but of course, they won't tell you where the tipping points are. You may be convinced that there are 5 tipping points lying in wait because the model says so and the model looks reasonable. But you haven't an idea as to where they are, except, within range. So, all right, by the time you take all this complete, the combinations of various possibilities into account, you're in a mess. I would resist doing that.
Yes.
I wouldn't do that. I would essentially sketch out and say, well, look, we're really heading into danger zones.
Yes.
And qualitatively, we want to be doing as much as possible. You have to, in other words, the onus should be on the person who says, I'm going to ignore it.
Yes.
To show that
yeah.
we should ignore it. And, you know, at the end of the day, there's this famous quote in the paper by Shove, 1942, which I have quoted in my review because it's extremely important. And Shove was quoting somebody else who said, this is 1942 he was writing, which he says it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So I would not go in for, I would be going for scenarios, and I would be looking for danger zones, avoid it, and you have to show why you know it's advisable not to avoid it because there's something even worse that you want to avoid, and so forth.
No, I understand. To almost put your words into rephrase it, we don't over-engineer this in a sense. We know that there are terrible risks on the upside. We don't necessarily have to worry too much about whether the further risks or whether we're prepared to accept them. But we know there's some problem once we go beyond a certain area, and that's probably enough information for us to act in a risk management manner and address the concerns that you're discussing in your review without worrying too much about whether is 3 to 5% even worse than 3 to 5 degrees worse than 0 to 3 degrees. It probably doesn't matter. It's kind of
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
We have a question from Ying Jin, a colleague in Cambridge, who is asking, with the natural uncertainties in the valuations and price estimates of long-term impacts, how could one start from the other end? Could one start from the other end and begin to drive policy interventions on the ground in the short term? So it's a question about, I mean, I guess it's related to the thing we've just discussed. We've got this view that in the long run, it's very bad. So how do we proceed in the short run? Are there any sequences about things we might do first and things we might do second? And how do we get all this work started? If I could...
Extremely good question. These are very fine questions. Thank you very much. And I can't necessarily say that I'll be able to give you a satisfactory answer. In fact, I know I won't. But think of it this way. I think the way I've addressed it in the review is to first, what you were discussing, inclusive wealth, that comes only in chapter 13, as late as that. Why? The reason is that I really wanted to guide the reader earlier into recognizing that we are really in trouble. Yeah. We're really in trouble in that the demand exceeds supply in a big, big way. So that's it. And then there's a good deal of ecology in the first 4 chapters, a good deal of earth science and ecology to back up the idea that the sense of the global scale of the problem we are faced with. Now, I said it's like a firefighting situation. Now, suppose a fire service is called upon, and then so that there's a fire raging in the local woodlands. Okay. Now, what would the strategy be? Their strategy is not going to be in advance know what to do. They're going to first look at the terrain, the direction of wind, vegetation, the mapping of the vegetation, altitude, and so forth, distribution of altitude, and so forth. All right. And then it's only then that they will come to. And we are at the stage of actually the first stage. We know we have overdone it.
Yep.
There are in the case of planetary boundaries language, out of the 9 planetary boundaries, 2 are dangerously out of control. Okay. And 2 others are in the neighborhood of what they think. Now, that doesn't mean that they're right necessarily, by the way. But I'm talking now about the best earth scientists around, and they're telling us, so we better take them seriously, at least put up a good argument as to why they might be wrong. Yeah. And we don't have that knowledge. So, at least I don't. So I have to take them into account. Now, if we're in that kind of a situation, we don't worry too much about the fineries of cost-benefit analysis. It's almost a bit like the 1950s notions of planning, where you said, look, we really are starved of basic capital goods, starved of roads, because villages can't connect.
Yeah.
Now there, you can do some cost-benefit analysis for sure, but the idea would be to have a package for a fund for road building,
Yes.
And you could then say, of course, in order to have an optimal allocation, you need to have shadow prices and the whole lot. But you start doing that, you're really in trouble.
Yeah.
You have to have some notion of what priorities are. Likewise in education, for example, they're full of priorities. One needs to do that without necessarily thinking in terms of shadow prices. Yeah. Shadow prices are extremely important. It goes without saying at the micro level, and we all do it. Private companies do it in one way or the other. Intangible assets, for example, private companies have to take that into account. Reputation, if nothing else, take that. Now, they're not going to say, here's the shadow price of reputation, but they said, reputation matters, so we mustn't do this. It's damaging it.
So against the mental picture you're causing me to draw is this idea of a war-ravaged country in the 1950s, with all kinds of building needing to be undertaken to give people housing. You've just got to get on with it. You've got to start the reconstruction. You can't hang around. You've got to get on with it and not worry too much. I mean, that's the way, and it's interesting to think of it in those terms, that planning that needed to be done, and the architecture that was adopted at the time. So that's an incredibly helpful mental picture. Thank you for that, Partha. Just one final question, which is from Lorenzo Forni at Promescia in Milan. And that's we just stand aside from the immediate and the emergency. We're going to measure natural capital. And I think you pointed towards the UK's progress on this, which has been very good in many areas. It does require teams of different skills, economists, engineers, climatologists, ecologists. Do we need some new institutions in which these people can collect? Of course, one might argue universities are able to do that, but maybe we need something established that would be doing that domestically and overseas to bring people together with this particular focus in mind. This is the Natural Capital Institute. Is that one way of tackling it, or have you got other ideas as to how?
I haven't actually. I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint you. I haven't actually given thought to it. I couldn't say what ideally. I mean, it's a natural thing to say is that, well, the ONS in this country ought to be guiding it, if you like.
Yeah.
Now, whether they want to decentralize by saying it's not for us, we're going to establish a Natural Capital Institute which will do that, and then they'll be feeding it in and so forth. Yeah. Those are details over which I really have no expertise.
Okay, no, that's quite right. I think the question was coming about how do we get these teams together? How do we introduce multi and interdisciplinarity ways of getting at these things? And you're right, there are national statistical agencies that could be asked to develop these, but I guess they've also got a huge agenda.
I think this brings us back to a question that is often asked of me as to why we economists have missed the boat on this in a big way. And missed the boat in the sense that in all fairness, we economists are nowhere even in climate discussions at the UN, nor in biodiversity discussions. So let's not, we publish a lot on climate change, but I haven't seen climate models that economists have produced being used in COP26. But not much. I mean, climate science, yes, heck of a lot. That's influenced it, but we economists haven't been. And I think one reason may be, there is some writing on this, is that we economists tend to read each other too much. We don't read, even a climate scientist, this bibliography will be climate economist. Bibliography will be other climate economists.
Yeah.
But we really need to go to the primary sources. And I think one of the things that we could think of encouraging, particularly in universities, is greater collaboration, real solid collaboration in both teaching, not just research, but in teaching as well, amongst ecologists and economists, because they are very similar subjects, by the way.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that both start, the prefix is eco. That's a very good reason, but that's a historical reason. But if you study any ecology text, you'll be saying, I'm reading a book on capital theory. That's what I'm doing. I mean, I've been reading it quite a while, for many years now, and that's why the review has taken the shape it has, because I realized that, of course, these are all capital assets, and that's what ecologists are studying, capital goods.
There's a thought for the future. New papers on the tripos and new choices on the MPhil.
We could do worse.
Yeah, ecology, economists, and epidemiology. I can see the three E's emerging at some point in the future. Partha Dasgupta, has been an absolute delight as ever to talk to you this afternoon. I've learned so much from the review, but if I may say so much from talking to you over the years as well. So glad you're able to join us today for the start of the Euroframe Conference. Let me also just say that Partha's additional thoughts on the review is a paper that he's written and will be published in the National Institute Economic Review later this month. We're delighted to have that paper in there, and it really does offer more than a coda, I think, an echo and something that further trumpets the excellence of his diversity review. I think we should thank the Treasury for commissioning and being smart enough to ask you to write it and getting that work out there, but for forcing us to think about things I think for too long we've ignored as economists. I'm pretty sure the next generation will not ignore them, and in that sense that will be at least some fitting tribute to the work that you've been doing over your life and with respect to this review. Partha Dasgupta, thank you ever so much this afternoon.
Pleasure.
See you very soon. Bye.